And also they removed references to Bryan Adams as the two things that would not withstand the test of time.
Welcome to Keep It Fictional, a weekly podcast for book lovers by book lovers. Build your to-be-read list with Sadie, Liz, Virginia, Fiona, and Corene from the Port Moody Public Library. Warning, this podcast contains strong opinions and may cause an increase in your library holds list.
Do you remember the first book you picked up as a child that you really connected with? Maybe it had a character in it that you related to, or a format that really let you engage. Or maybe it was your introduction to a genre that would become a lifelong favorite. Whatever the reason, there was just something about the book that resonated with you to become a childhood favorite. I have had a few books like this from my childhood and a few that have stayed with me. And I've often found myself wondering, would I still love this book today? And this, my friends, is what we are going to be discussing on today's episode of Keep It Fictional. Welcome, everyone, to the podcast from the Port Moody Public Library, a podcast for book lovers by book lovers. I am Sadie, and I am your host today. And I am joined by my book friends, Emma and Corene. And today, the three of us will be looking back at a book that we read as a child or a teenager or a young adult. I'm not sure where this all falls for us each individually, and seeing if these books actually live up to our memories and our fondness of them. Now, I'm very excited to hear about what my book friends reread for this week. I'm also curious, as you talk about your books, to know what drew you to this book in the first place. What about this book made it a favorite the very first time that you read it? I know, Corene, you are a book rereader, I believe. Yes. Now, Emma, I think that we asked you this question in your first episode on the podcast, and I think that you said most of the time, but it depends on the book, maybe.
I've reread stuff when I was a teenager. I kind of had my favorite book. So I would The Fault in Our Stars was one of my favorites when I was a teen. So I reread that probably 5 or 6 times. The book I'm talking about today, I actually have reread before. So this is my second time revisiting it as an adult, but I am kind of picky about what I choose to reread. It has to be an all-time absolute favorite. And something I have done is I read the book for the first time, but then I listen to the audiobook when I do it on a reread. I'll consume the book in different mediums or in different formats when I revisit them. But yeah, I don't revisit everything, but I will revisit some things if they are exceptional.
So that's kind of what my memory said. And I am definitely not a rereader. I very rarely reread. So I'm the minority on the podcast rereading wise today, but that is okay. We have all reread a book for today's episode, and I am excited to hear what you have reread. So Emma, we're going to start with you. What book did you reread for today's episode?
All right. So like I said, this is actually my second time revisiting this series. I read a series. I did not read the whole series for today's episode because it's 13 books, but I did read the first 6. So I actually was just listening to the 6 audiobook on the SkyTrain. I think I have about 12 minutes left in it. But today I have a series of unfortunate events by Lemony Snicket, the pen name of author Daniel Handler. And the books we had at the library, the first one has this cover, which is not the cover that I grew up with. So that's very jarring for me. Numbers 2 and 3 that I have with me here today do have the original covers that I grew up with. But the first book is called The Bad Beginning. But this is one of my all-time favorite series from as a kid. I don't think I read a lot of middle grade as a kid. I've tried to rethink as to what middle grade I read growing up, and I really cannot come up with any book titles. But I do remember this series quite vividly. I remember my mom bought the series, so we actually had them at home, and I was reading the books that we had at home. I remember having to wait for the later ones to come out because when we got into it, the series wasn't complete at that point. I think it was around grades 3 or 4 that I read them for the first time. But I really, really loved them as a kid. Me and my sister were both really into them. I was really into the mystery aspect, the suspense aspect. I liked that it was kind of a high stakes sort of like an adventure story, but it didn't have fantasy in it. I liked like the realistic fiction aspect. And I think this was probably my gateway to reading things. Something that's kind of stuck with me in adulthood is I really like to read things that are like extremely dark and depressing. And I think this was kind of the gateway for that, where it's like a book. It's a series of unfortunate events. It's a series where terrible things just continue to happen to these children over and over again. But yeah, growing up, it was a good like bonding point for me and my siblings. We had a board game. We had a like PlayStation video game with a series of unfortunate events. I remember when the original movie was released and absolutely hating it. I thought it was so awful. But I also just don't like Jim Carrey very much, who was cast to play Count Olaf. And there's actually a newer screen adaptation of it. Netflix did a show, I think, between like 2017 and 2019. And that show, I think, really did a good job of capturing like the original like whimsy of the books. I think the Netflix adaptation is actually really excellently done. It's got like funny deadpan narration and like a little asides that you get from the Lemony Snicket character. And they incorporate those like funny vocabulary lessons that they have in the original series. So I think they really did an excellent job of like capturing the energy and the vibe of the original material. So yeah, I revisited this series back when I was in university, kind of around the time that the Netflix show came out. And when I reread the books then, I was like, oh my God, these books absolutely hold up. Like the show did a really great job of adapting them accurately to the original story. And it was really fun to revisit them now, or really fun to revisit them then. And again, really fun again to revisit them now. So if you're unfamiliar with these books, it's a 13 book long series, and each of the books kind of follows a similar format. So at the beginning, we've got the three Baudelaire siblings: 14-year-old Violet, who is a skilled inventor; 12-year-old Klaus, who is an avid reader and researcher; and then infant Sunny, whose main talent is biting things with her four very sharp teeth. At the beginning of the first book, The Bad Beginning, the Baudelaire mansion was destroyed in a terrible fire that kills both of their parents. So the orphans are then taken into the care of Mr. Poe, who's a well-meaning but generally pretty useless banker, who for some reason was named the executor of their estate. So they kind of continue to go back to him in between different guardians. Mr. Poe sends the orphans to live with a distant relative that they'd never heard of before, named Count Olaf. And Olaf is a pretty despicable person, kind of from the get-go. You can tell that he's the bad guy of the series. He makes the kids clean his dilapidated house all day. He makes them cook for his rowdy theater troupe of mediocre actors. They're actually pretty terrible. And he gives them only one bed to share and assaults them both verbally and physically. So he's pretty terrifying for the kids. And Olaf's whole scheme throughout the whole series is that he's after the Baudelaire fortune, which Violet is set to inherit when she comes of age, when she turns 18. So in the first book, Olaf plots to steal the fortune by putting on this play called The Marvelous Marriage, where he, playing the groom, is going to marry Violet, playing the bride, except he gets a real judge to officiate the marriage and perform the marriage rites on stage so that it would be totally legal. He's marrying a 14-year-old, and then he's going to steal all of her money. So with Violet's inventing skills and Klaus's legal research, they're able to kind of outsmart Olaf, kind of catch him in his scheme before he's able to get away with it. And the children are swiftly after that pretty much removed from his care and taken to their next guardian. And each book kind of follows that similar structure where the kids start with a new guardian. Olaf appears usually wearing a really poorly constructed disguise. The children try to convince the adults in their life that this is Count Olaf. He's after our fortune. He won't leave us alone. But nobody ever believes them, regardless of how terrible Olaf's disguises are. Olaf hatches a plan, the children foil his plan, and sometimes the guardian that they're currently living with ends up getting killed in the process. So they're quite dark. They're quite tragic stories. There's a lot of death that these poor children have to encounter. But yeah, one of my favorite aspects of it is they stay with like such an eccentric cast of different guardians. They stay with a snake specialist in the second one. They stay with an agoraphobe who's obsessed with grammar. They go to a probably gay owner of a lumber mill. He's kind of implied to be in a partnership with a man. They go to boarding school. They live with an evil, wealthy financial advisor. They end up being raised by an entire village. And then in the later books, they get framed for a crime and have to go on the run. So the stakes kind of get higher and higher with their situation as the books go on. One of the most interesting, in my opinion, aspects of this story is as you get further into the series, more and more is revealed about the nature of the Baudelaire fire, kind of the conspiracy of what happened and whether or not it was arson. You learn a bit more about like the origins of Count Olaf's obsession with the children and his connection to the Baudelaire parents. And the whole time there's like you're gradually getting more information about this secret organization that links all of the characters together called VFD. So there's a lot of cool like conspiracy mystery stuff that as a kid I was just like picking apart all the clues and trying to figure out everything that was connecting all the stories together. So yeah, obviously as a kid, I ate these up. I absolutely love these books. And they're really fun to reread as an adult because you can read one book in like an hour and a half. So I've been blasting through this series the past couple weeks. It's been really great for a reading slump. I've read a couple other books since the year began, but I've been mostly committing my time to a series of unfortunate events, and it's been so enjoyable for me. So Sadie, I appreciate you for picking this topic because this has been really, really fun for me to reread these books. Some of the obvious appeals to the series is like how clever the kids are, how they're always kind of outwitting and outsmarting these bumbling adults that they find in their lives. Violet always has to like scrap together different inventions to get them out of sticky situations. Klaus is always teaching them these like new words and concepts because he's kind of the brain of the operation. And even Sunny, who is like a literal baby, can understand and contribute to her siblings and even adult discussions and kind of help them with their plots. So even at times when the adults like don't know what's going on, Sunny is like, "How do you not see? This is Count Olaf," and she's an infant. So it's super fun. I love how intelligent these children are. It like reading these books as a kid really makes you like want to be Violet. You want to be Klaus. You want to be there kind of solving these mysteries along with them. And the books are also extremely quirky. I find them very whimsical. They have these, and these elements of them haven't lessened the book's appeal as I've gotten older. So like they were very fun and quirky as a kid, and they definitely kind of maintain that reading them as an adult as well. I like that they're impossible to place in time and location. They've got this kind of like steampunk, vaguely North American society, but they've got some modern technology. And I think that helps them stand the test of time is because they're not in a very specific time period. When I was a kid, they were really good books and they kind of hold up in today's day and age as well. And I love that Lemony Snicket has a really interesting way of like playing with language throughout the stories. He'll use a really long, complicated word and then go, which here means, and either define it or sometimes he like defines it within the context of the story and how it relates to the Baudelaires. But then he'll continue to use those longer and more complicated words throughout the book. Like the sixth book that I'm reading right now is called The Ersatz Elevator. So when he first uses the word ersatz, he defines it, but then the kids continue to use the word throughout the book. So it's if you're like into vocabulary, if you're a kid that like just loves to be smarter than the other kids around you, they're really really fun for that. Like books for brainy kids. I really really enjoyed them as a kid, and those little kind of like linguistic jokes or the like vocabulary jokes that they do. I think they make the books much more entertaining to read as an adult than some other kids' books that I've read. So yeah, if you haven't read this series yet, obviously you can tell I really, really love it. I would highly, highly recommend checking them out, even if you're an adult or if you're a kid. I think they're really fun for anybody of any age. I also think that you're welcome to check out the TV adaptation that Netflix did. I think they did a really great job of capturing kind of the original energy of the story. They still do those like little asides with the vocab lessons. You've got really funny like deadpan narration from Lemony Snicket's character. So I'd recommend checking that out as well. The books are never boring. They're kind of tragic and depressing, but without losing that silliness or quirkiness. And Count Olaf is, I would say, one of the most perfect villains of children's literature. He is both terrifying and also like very, very silly. It's easy to see through his plots, but that doesn't stop him from like murdering people and like murdering the kids' guardians. So he's a villain that really, really stuck with me. And I've been listening to the audiobooks this past week, and Tim Curry narrates them, and those are really good. So this is the first time I'd listened to them. I had read the books as a kid, but if you enjoy audiobooks and if you listen to audiobooks with your family, if you have kids in your life, the Tim Curry series of Unfortunate Events audiobooks are really phenomenal. So yeah, I think that probably sells it. I love this series. I think everyone should read it. So if you haven't yet, you should check out A Series of Unfortunate Events, which holds up.
That's excellent, Emma. I have not actually read them. I feel like they're something that I probably would enjoy. And I did watch part of the Netflix series because it has Neil Patrick Harris in it, who is one of my favorites. I think he was Count Olaf.
I have a comment about that. I was originally like, I don't know how I feel about him playing Olaf. And Jim Carrey played Olaf in the original movie, which I was quite anti. I don't like Jim Carrey. It's a personal thing. But I was so impressed with Neil Patrick Harris's interpretation of Olaf. I think he did fantastic. So yeah, the show's really, really well done.
Maybe I will revisit the show and also not revisit, but visit the audiobooks because I do love Tim Curry as well. Can do no wrong, at least on a professional level. I don't know much about him personally, but not sure if he's done anything questionable. I hope not. But yes, so I will definitely look into those.
He has made some questionable career decisions. If you really want to give yourself a laugh, there is some acting that he did in a video game that you really must treat yourself to. If you're feeling sad, it will absolutely lift you up. That man is absolutely unhinged in the best way.
I think that's what it is. Like, even when he does the strangest things, he does it with Tim Curry flair. And
there's like a wonderful little observation that someone made about Muppet movies. And so Michael Caine treats Muppet movies as, the most dead serious acting job he has ever done. He fully commits. He is like Michael Caine. He is Scrooge in a world of Muppets. And this is a serious business production. Whereas Tim Curry in his Muppet movie becomes one of the Muppets.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. That definitely fits. All right. Well, thank you, Emma. As I said, I'm very glad it withstood the test of time, and hopefully there will be some people who will pick it up that did not when they were children, or maybe it will inspire you to revisit it if you also loved it when you were a child. All right. I am going to talk about my book next. And for mine, as soon as we decided on this topic, and I need to give the credit to Sydney, one of our colleagues, because Sydney is the one who suggested this. Sydney asked if we had ever done one where we had reread a book from childhood, and we hadn't done one. So thank you, Sydney, for this topic. And as soon as Sydney had mentioned it, I knew exactly what I was going to read. I've actually been saying for quite a few years, hey, I should read that series again. And it just never happened. So immediately I knew that this is what I was going to do. That being said, getting the book proved a little bit harder than I had anticipated. Now, I own the entire series. I may have lost one book. It is a 12-book series. I own the whole thing, but it was delegated to a box buried in our storage closet a few years ago. And I had no idea how much digging I was going to have to do in order to find it. So I tried to find it other places before I did that. But it is not available as an ebook. It's not available as an audiobook. It's not available through interlibrary loan. Pretty sure it's out of print. And it would have taken about a month and a half, I think, to get here from Amazon, and was probably way more expensive than I wanted to play. Now, Russell Books in Victoria had one copy, but I was trying to get it during the postal strike. And so shipping was about 5 times the cost of the book itself, which was $4. And I was not willing to pay over $20 in shipping for a $4 book. So I finally dragged the boxes out of my storage unit. I found my copy. Thankfully, did not have to dig too far back there. So this is Search for Senna, the first book of the Everworld series by K.A.Applegate. Now, I would say if you grew up in the 90s, you probably know K.A.Applegate or Catherine Applegate from her Animorphs fame. These days, yeah. She's more associated with the One and Only series, so the One and Only Ivan, Bob, Ruby, among other books that she has continued to publish as the years have gone on. So the Everworld series came out around the same time as Animorphs, I think maybe a little bit afterwards. It came out in the late 90s, the early 2000s. And it's a young adult series that is fantasy and mythology inspired. I didn't realize it at the time, but I think that Everworld was sort of my into the fantasy genre and fantasy series specifically. My parents had always bought me books for Christmas. I wasn't a huge reader as a kid, but I was always reading something. And there were definitely books that I enjoyed, but I think that this series was the first one that was kind of like my my genre. I had found my genre. I completely dove into the series entirely. As I said, I bought all 12 books. I don't remember when exactly I came into this series. They may have been published for a year or two. So I did have to wait for some of them to come out, but I loved it. I like fell right into it and never wanted to stop reading it. So our story follows 5 teenagers who have been brought against their will and for most against their knowledge into a magical world called Everworld. And it all begins with Senna. David doesn't know exactly how or why, but he knows that Senna is the reason for everything that has happened. Senna, David's girlfriend, Christopher's ex-girlfriend, and April's half-sister. Jaleel is the only one who isn't directly connected to her, but he was there, wasn't he, when it all started? The day outside the Taco Bell? The day that Christopher and his friends decided to threaten David? When Christopher's friend decided to take it too far and punched David in the nose. They were all there. David, Christopher, April, Jaleel, and of course, Senna. At the time, that was their only real connection. David was relatively new to school, having moved to, I think it's Chicago, with his mom after his parents got divorced. He never imagined that Senna, beautiful, quiet, a little mysterious, would ever be interested in him. But here we go. Somehow, miraculously, she was. She didn't leave Christopher for David, but there was definitely still a grudge there. Senna had always been philosophical, talking about things that David never fully understood. But one night, while the two of them were sitting by the water, the things she started saying really made no sense. "Will you promise to come after me?" she asked David. "Will you promise to rescue me when it happens?" "Yes," David says, "of course." What else could he say? First mistake. The next morning, David decides to go for an early morning run. His mom's new boyfriend stayed over again, and he really just needs to get out of the house. He's still struggling to breathe out of his punched-in nose, but the fresh air and the intense cardio do make him feel a little bit better. He finds himself back down by the water when he sees her, Senna, sitting on a bench, looking over the lake. He's about to go up to her when the water in front of her starts moving, swirling in a very not natural way. That's when he notices that he's not the only one who's there. Christopher, April, and Jaleel also stand close by, witnessing this strange event. Before their eyes, the water swirls up, and out of it emerges a gigantic wolf. David finds himself running without even thinking, running towards Senna. But before he can reach her, the wolf grabs hold of her in its jaws and disappears back into the water. And then the world explodes. When David wakes up, he finds himself chained and suspended along a rocky cliff. He struggles to look to his sides, but he can just make out April, Christopher, and Jaleel chained up beside him. In the distance, he sees what looks like a Viking longboat coming towards the shore below where they are. Before the four of them can take stock of exactly what has happened and where they are unlocked and marched through an ancient-looking stone castle by a group of what can only be described as not humans. They're herded into the throne room and brought before a larger-than-life in both energy and physical size being, who is demanding to know what they have done with Senna. Now, David, April, Christopher, and Jaleel really have no idea what is happening, and they have no clue where Senna is. But this man does not seem to be very accepting of the truth. He pronounces that he is Loki, god of tricks and chaos, and that he had sent his son, the wolf, Fenrir, to bring Senna, or as he calls her, the witch, back to him. But somehow she managed to escape and has now disappeared. Loki seems to grow in size right before their eyes. Terrified but unable to move, David and the others have no idea how they are going to get out of here. This is their introduction to Everworld, a world run by gods that somehow stuck in the past, or maybe a slice of history that has been preserved at the exact point that it was copied and shifted into this other dimension. The four friends aren't entirely sure how it all works. All they know is that they are stuck here in a world where Norse, Mayan, and Incan mythologies are playing out before them, where ancient Vikings walk around as if they always have, and where alien creatures exist and may be controlling everything, and where there is a battle coming, one that the four of them are being drawn into. All they want to do is find their way home, get out of this nightmare, and wake up back in their beds in the real world. But David made a promise. He promised Senna that he would come after her. And while he didn't understand at the time what he was promising, he will keep his promise. He won't be going home until he has found her. So I would say that for the most part, this book did stand up to my memories of it, at least kind of in a general sense. I definitely really enjoyed reading the first one. When I first read it, I loved the series, was kind of completely drawn into it, but I don't remember a lot of the specifics of it. There's definitely a lot more mythology than I realized or remembered there being. And I think that it's interesting reading this now in like a post-Avengers on the big screen world where everyone, even if they don't want to, know the names of Loki and Thor and Odin. And I think that at the time it was written, the mythologies it touches on weren't necessarily as well known maybe in mainstream media as they are today. And so it probably could have been a really cool introduction to those mythologies if you were someone who was interested in mythologies that weren't just Greek mythology, because I feel like those are always quite well represented. Yeah, so I think that it could have been a very cool introduction to those. I don't know if I was aware of it at the time or if I just enjoyed other aspects of it and paid no attention to who the actual players were. There's a lot of emphasis. I was telling Emma this yesterday. There's a lot more emphasis on like what it means to be a strong man and a good man. And some of David's characteristics definitely veer into the realm of toxic masculinity, I would say, in the ways that my teenage self either didn't bother to notice or it just went completely over my head. That being said, a lot of the other characters challenge these characteristics and ideas. And so I think that K.A.Applegate put them in there, not maybe just because that was how characters were written at that time, but also as a way to kind of challenge those ideas a little bit. And I think that I'd have to reread the whole series to see if David's character arc allows for him to have a little bit of personality transformation and maybe broaden his perspectives just a little bit. I'd also forgotten that each book is narrated by a different character. And so I'm curious to read more of them because I didn't find that I connected a lot with David. So I'm interested to see if maybe one of the other characters I find that I relate to a little bit more. David, by the end of this book, was kind of getting on my nerves, but I did read like the preview of the second book in the back of this, which is narrated by Christopher, and his perspective I enjoyed a little bit more, even just in those first chapters. The book was definitely more graphic than I remember it being. Applegate definitely does not shy away from scenes of gore and violence and death. And while I think that in today's standards, the book doesn't necessarily lend the right amount of sensitivity or weight to certain topics like gender rights, sexism, racism, things like that, the topics and the issues are being talked about and are being addressed in the book. And so I feel like for the time, that was probably more than some other books and series had. So I do give props to her for that, for actually including those issues and including them and actually having some discussions surrounding them, even if they weren't necessarily done in the most sensitive way as they could be. Same with Emma. I think that we'll find with most kids' books, they're short, they're easy reads as an adult. I read this very, very quickly. It's only just under 200 pages. So yeah, my official review is yes, this book definitely does live up to my childhood memories of it. I am glad that I reread it. I will probably slowly make my way through the whole series and hope that whichever book I have a memory of losing, I don't know which one it is, I will be able to find somewhere for not a lot of money. So that is my book, Search for Senna and the Everworld series by K.A.Applegate. All right, I think that we are going to take a break and do our existential question. Now, we have talked a lot about rereading on this podcast. We talked about at the beginning, knowing kind of where we all stand. But I'm curious for my book friends, what makes a book rereadable for you? What are the kind of the characteristics of a book that it would have to have for you to consider rereading it?
Yeah, so I love to reread. I totally understand, Sadie, why you don't. There's so many books, so little time. But I do reread books, and I think it's because I enjoy the emotional journey that I go on when I read a particular book or a particular emotion that it evokes. Like for specific books, I just reread Tilly Waldron's On a Sunbeam. And I reread it partly because I really love the art, but partly because I really love like that moody atmosphere of like melancholy and loss, and then just like ever so slightly hopeful. And so I really didn't connect with as much as the characters because I did want to just like shake most or all of them. But it is that kind of like emotional journey, that kind of emotion that I wanted to feel. And so because I kind of know what happens, I know what the plot is, I know what the character is, I can just kind of like tap into that particular emotion that that book evokes.
Nice. I like that actually. I hadn't thought about it as like revisiting a certain feeling that a book brings out, but that's definitely like subconsciously what drives me to reread stuff. Usually when I reread stuff, it most often happens directly after I finish the book for the first time and I go, "Oh my God, I loved that." And I immediately go back to the beginning. That's happened to me a couple times in my life. Or I just like the book was so fun and I need some like I reread Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston because it was just so fun and I was in a reading slump and I was like, you know what? I just need some like gay American exceptionalism. And I went back and reread that one and it was lovely and I enjoyed it. Or like I reread the Song of Achilles pretty much immediately after I had finished the book the first time because I was like I just need to cry again. I just like I can't let it be over. So I immediately went back and started from the beginning. But for me, I usually read books like with a series of unfortunate events or with books that I reread when I was younger. I reread them because they're really nostalgic, because it was something that I really loved like years prior. So I want to revisit it just to kind of get back in those warm, comfortable feelings. Or if I'm in a reading slump, I'll go back to like favorite graphic novels, favorite manga series of mine, just to kind of bring back those like happy feelings, those like be able to jump back and read something that I know I will really, really connect with. But yeah, so I think my criteria is just like if it's something that's really nostalgic or if it's something that I'm just like in the mood for in that moment and I don't have the energy or the wherewithal to search out something new that will give me those same feelings. It's like, oh, I just want to read a happy love story that'll make me laugh. So I'll go back to Red, White, and Royal Blue, which I know will do that for me.
That's totally fair. I remember you saying when we discussed Song of Achilles that one I think you were sitting on a beach at the time and you you immediately started reading it again.
With that one specifically, I had it with me on vacation and I brought a bunch of books with me, but I had finished all of them. So when I finished the Song of Achilles, I was like, well, I have no other new books, so I'm going to reread this one again because it was so good.
So strangely enough, I just finished a book yesterday that I actually had the impulse to do that with, that I wanted to almost immediately go back to the beginning and listen to it. So I listened to the audiobook. And I will be talking about the book in a couple of weeks, so I won't say much more than that. But yes, I will tell everyone in a couple of weeks what book that was and why exactly I wanted to go back. As a kid, I used to have yearly books that I would reread. And I used to have like my holiday books. So every Christmas, I would always read the Sweet Valley Kids holiday one where they get stuck in the mall. I think that's every child's dream, to get stuck in the mall overnight. And I kind of had like the same ones that I would read every single year. And I think it was that feeling that that comfort, that nostalgia, and that feeling that I knew I would get from reading them. These days, I think that it has to, as I said, I don't reread a lot, but I think that if I'm going to be revisiting a series or if there's an adaptation of the series coming out, I will sometimes reread it. So the Discovery of Witches series, I reread that one right before the TV adaptation came out of that one. I reread one, I think, for the podcast a little while ago of a series that I was going to be revisiting kind of the whole series. Yeah, so if I ever want to kind of revisit the series in total, or if there's going to be an adaptation coming out, then I will often do a reread. But there's too many. There's just too many books. Don't have time. All right. Well, let's see what Corene has brought for us. What childhood favorite will you be talking about?
Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about not just a childhood book from my own past, but from my roommate's past as well. So I had to borrow her copy of this particular book that is held together with like scotch tape and like prayer. It is falling apart from being reread so many times, and I have reread it so many times. And so it was so interesting to go back and kind of read something that really captured my imagination for such a long time. And so this is the Ruth Schwartz Award, Canadian award winner, The Hunter's Moon by O.R. Melling. And this is like a great cover. It's mysterious. There's fairies. There's kind of a creepy guy without a shirt now, I realize. Huh. And, it's got like a mood. It's very The Mysteries of Harris Burdick by Chris Van Allen. Like, it's got all of that. And so, yeah, this is a book that absolutely had all of my attention for such a long time. And it starts with a law that everyone knows. In Ireland, you don't sleep on a fairy mound. More specifically, and Sadie's nodding her head because she knows. She knows. More specifically, you don't sleep on the Mound of Tara, which is the ancient seat of the High Kings of Ireland. It's just not something you do. If you do, great misfortune will befall you. However, two cousins, one Canadian cousin, Gwen, and one Irish cousin, Finevere, they are bound and determined to find their way into fairyland, and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get there, including breaking this ancient law. And now, as an adult, realizing, like, where are your parents? Where are the park officials? This is a national heritage site, and you're just lounging upon it. But anyways, they take their backpacks and they settle down for a sleepless night. However, in their dreams, a really hot guy appears and says, "Oh, come away with me to fairyland." Finevere is like, "Yeah, absolutely. Sign me up. Let's go." Gwen, being a sensible Canadian, says, "No, I don't think that's a good idea." And so Gwen wakes up alone, and Finevere is nowhere to be found. Gwen, the only one really knowing what happened and that her cousin has been kidnapped by fairies, embarks on an epic quest. And at the front of this book, there is a beautiful little map that both me and my roommate, we really want to do the Hunter's Moon bike trip through Ireland. So she decides to go on an epic quest, meeting friend and foe along the way to try and get her cousin back from these immortal beings. However, when she gets there, will she be able to really convince Finevere to leave? Now, this book is infused with Irish and Celtic mythology, which as a young child, I loved. I love the idea of there just being like the real world and then this fantasy world where there are little pockets of it that you can kind of sneak into if you know where to look. It's kind of like infused with the different stories from Celtic mythology, which I loved. I enjoyed it. I was obsessed with kind of like the fairy world. I was obsessed with like the stories of fairies. And so this like absolutely captured my imagination. I remember like writing my own stories, like very loosely based on this or not so loosely based on this, was absolutely obsessed with this story. And it kind of blew my mind that, oh my goodness, like it's a Canadian heroine, like she's from Canada, just like me, which was not kind of the norm as this book was published in, and brace yourself, 1993. So it is 31 years old, which is kind of interesting, which definitely shone through when I was rereading it now in the year of 2025, because there are some very stark differences, just cultural differences, right? Like it's 30 years later, things are definitely different. And something that I've kind of seen within my, even just like career as a librarian or as a reader, is like the emergence of the YA genre and even the middle grade genre that you were talking about, Emma. Both of these genres have kind of like exploded over the last years. Whereas I think like when a lot of us were growing up, there simply wasn't that much selection. There was maybe a shelf of Nancy Drew and the Bobbsey Twins and maybe Cherry Ames, like Girl Nurse. And that was it. There were kind of like your classics, but there wasn't like the breadth of choice and diversity that there is now. And so kind of reading this, which was I think, marketed more as a teen book. It reads so young. So young. It reads like a middle grade book would today because, there was no YA market. There was no YA, like there was Judy Blume's, the one where they have sex in. And I think that was it. That was the entirety of the YA genre. And so it's very interesting kind of seeing what would have been considered like a YA book compared to what's written right now, and that it's very sweet, it's very simple, it's very like action packed. The writing is, sorry, O.R. Melling, it's not particularly deep. Like it's just a little like, and this happened, and here we go, and we're doing this. And you know what? Like it made a super fast read, which was really fun, but it isn't striving for poetics is the word that what I'm going to say. What was absolutely hilarious in a lot of the reviews that I was reading on Goodreads is they're like, where are the parents? Like, how come they can just like go around wherever they want? And like, yes, now as an adult now, I'm like, they are 16 years old and they are going on a vacation through the entire country by themselves. What was definitely shocking now as a modern reader was the amount of hitchhiking they do, which was a lot. Like they're just hopping into any old man's car, and that's cool and that's fine. And yeah, as a modern reader, I was like, oh no, oh no. Definitely, as well as like the lack of cell phones or just like communication with their parents who are just fine with sending the 16-year-old off to a foreign country to bike around it. Still holds up. It's very like sweet and innocent. Everyone that Gwen meets is like overwhelmingly kind, even if she's hitchhiking with them and they're just a middle-aged businessman all by himself. So everyone falls in love at first sight, and like the men are non-threatening and fun and really sweet. What was also very interesting was kind of like, again, we have to think this is 1993, the height of Kate Moss. A lot of like the weird body politics around kind of like fat shaming and, talking and policing young people's bodies. What I really loved when reading this as a kid is Gwen is kind of like described as chubby, and she has a lot of like self-confidence issues about that, especially compared to like her beautiful and lithe cousin who everyone loves, and she kind of feels like a frump, which again, like for 1993, like talking about that and making that the heroine and, making her struggle a little bit, but find her self-confidence after was kind of lovely. But that was still also kind of like, oh, huh. But again, it's a different time. It's a different culture in a way. Like we've moved on so much. Teen culture has moved on so much as a society. We've kind of moved on where certain things are just not described in certain ways. What I really enjoyed when I flipped through the Wikipedia article was there were two editions. There was like the OG original version, and then there was like the slightly updated version. And in the original edition, what they took out were references to the film Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, which I would argue is a great movie that definitely holds up, kind of. And also they removed references to Bryan Adams as the two things that would not withstand the test of time, which just like just tickled me pink, that those are the two things that people wouldn't get. So would I hand this to a teenager now? No, absolutely not. They would laugh and laugh and laugh. And again, a lot of the Goodreads reviews were like, what is this? There's like a little battle at the end, and someone's like, this is a far cry from Minas Tirith. And I was like, yeah, it is. This is just a very sweet little adventure story. I really enjoyed it, again, through the lens of nostalgia. These are the rose-colored glasses that I could not take off. And it was very sweet. So like it holds up for me, and I think it has a very special place in my heart and the heart of a lot of readers that read it at that point in their lives. It's really hard to say, like, especially when you're writing for kids, which kind of really depends on trends, the same with YA as well. Trends and slang and all of that, it moves on so fast. Like any reference to TikTok now in a book is probably going to be out of date in 5 years. Like what I think, as you said, Emma, what Lemony Snicket did is very cleverly like not make it ambiguous enough that it can kind of not feel dated no matter when you read it. And it's really interesting reading a book in kind of like that pre-cell phone time and how different the stories are because of it. And then all those readers that have to contend with that because it changes plot, it changes the way people interact with each other. It really kind of also affects the culture in a huge way. So it was a really interesting reread. It held up for me. I don't know necessarily, again, that it would be a book that I would recommend to anyone, but for me, it held up.
I have to ask, did they replace Bryan Adams and Robin Hood Prince of Thieves with some like more modern? Or did they just not include them at all?
I don't know because I have the original version and I don't have the newer edition, which I think was just like a couple years later. So I don't know. It just said the older edition includes references to Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, and Bryan Adams. And I'm like, weirdly enough, Bryan Adams has withstood the test of time.
We're all very proud of him for that. Very proud as Canadians for Bryan Adams. Excellent. Well, thank you, Corene. I feel like if I had discovered that book as a child, that probably would have been one that I would have absolutely loved. I don't know if I will, the time for it has come and gone from my life, and I'm just going to be at peace with that. Well, thank you so much, Emma. Thank you so much, Corene, for sharing your childhood favorites with us today. Maybe we have inspired our listeners to go back and revisit one of your childhood favorites and see if it withstands the test of time. I think that the worry is always that it definitely will not. And I also respect wanting to preserve that memory the way that it is in your mind and in your heart. So yes, if you choose to revisit, I hope that it withstands time and is still a favorite for you. Thank you everyone for listening. We will see you next time on Keep It Fictional. Have a good day.
Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please tell a fellow book lover about it. You can find a list of all the books we discussed in our show notes. Join us next week for another fun book chat. Until then, keep it fictional.